G'day everybody and welcome back to Weiss Advice. I'm Josh from the channel Josh Richens Producer, and last night I frantically pulled all of the microphones off of my drum kit so I could go and play a gig. So I figured, why not take the opportunity to show you all my process for setting up drums in the studio. In this video I'm not going to tell you to go and buy a $5,000 drum kit, skin it with fresh heads and then put the most expensive microphones on it that you can. What I am going to focus on is much more so the general kind of best practices that you can follow while setting up your drums that are going to set you up for success in the long run. And I think you'll be surprised what you can achieve if you follow a few of these simple steps. I mean, all of these microphones are still plugged in. I have drum. This is technically a drum setup. I reckon you could make this work. You know what, give me 10 seconds. Look, that is a joke, but if you take anything away from my silliness, I hope it's that you don't have to be scared of making mistakes. Actually, making mistakes should be embraced. Without making mistakes, we can never know how far we can push rules before they break and how to make sure things are still working when they do break. I think Matt actually put it best. Somebody commented on one of Matt's videos saying, "I'm scared to start mixing my own rap vocals. Can you give me tips?" And I thought Matt's advice was great no matter who you are. Matt's advice was, everything you're afraid of doing, do on purpose. Make a mix that's as bad as you can make it, and then stash that to the side and do a real mix of the same song afterwards. Back to the video. Step 1, and probably the most important step, is to clean everything and get organized. Now that we've cleaned our space, it's time to make sure that we're organized and prepared. And I know this is all pretty mundane so far. Don't worry, we'll get to sound examples and fun stuff like that pretty soon. But trust me when I say that being prepared can be the difference between success and spending a few hours tracking down the source of that annoying crackle. So there's a few questions we're going to have to answer, like how is the drummer going to hear themselves? There are plenty of expensive monitor systems on the market, but the answer to this question can honestly be as simple as a headphone extension cable like this one here, or even a pair of headphones with a long cable like my old trusty DT770s. If you go for the headphone extension cable, it's worth getting a nicer one, as you will be adding another point where things can fail. For what I use, I sit somewhere in between the expensive monitor system and the cheap headphone cable, and I actually use this cheap little Behringer mixer. Now, that mixer is fed by 2 sets of stereo auxiliary outs, and one of those is always putting out a drum mix and the other one is putting out all of the audio coming from my computer. My drums stay set up all the time, and that means that when I'm practicing through a monitor mix. If I want to play along with sound coming from my computer, whether that's from a DAW, YouTube, a metronome, whatever it is, I have control over those levels right here. And usually you can find these little mixes for pretty cheap. So if you have the outputs on your interface, I highly recommend running this setup. If you're recording yourself, the next thing you might want to think about is how you're going to hit record. One of the cheapest options is going to be a wireless keyboard. And if you get good with your hotkeys, you don't even really have to look at the screen. You can just set your cursor to where you want to record from and then do the rest on the keyboard. What I use is actually this little Google tablet. I run an app called Connect on this, and it lets me use this as a wireless monitor over Wi-Fi, and that also lets me use the keyboard and mouse. I will admit, using a tablet like this does have a bunch of latency, and oftentimes there are connectivity issues through the Wi-Fi, and so if you're recording yourself and you really want to be able to move around the project, maybe something like this will help you. But if you're just setting up from one point and then doing a bunch of takes, you might actually want to go with the keyboard over something like a tablet. Now you want to make sure that you've got all of your cables, microphones, and stands in order. And for your cables and your microphones, make sure you test them first. As for your stands, if you're trying to save space like I am, you might want to consider looking for some stands with a round, heavy base like this one here. These are a great way to save space, but they are more susceptible to toppling over, especially if you have a heavy microphone on them like a large diaphragm condenser. Now I know, not everybody can, but if you can, I highly recommend getting your overheads on the roof. There are a lot of different ways to achieve this. Some of them are more complicated than others, but I've figured out one little trick that I think is super useful that I want to share with you. If you have structural beams poking out of your roof like I do, there's a neat little trick you can pull with one of these microphone adapters and a screw. So I'm sure you've all seen these 3/8 to 5/8 adapters before. And if you get a screw with just the right size head, you can actually poke them right through there and the screw will hold everything in place. Now, if you screw that onto one of your structural beams, you've got a receptacle for one of the top halves of your microphone stands to go onto. I do want to give this tip with a warning. You do need to be careful to make sure that you are making strong connections and that you are not tearing out the wood. But I still wanted to keep this tip in here because I know a lot of people are working in maybe garages out the back and places where there are structural beams above, and this can be a super useful way to save space. So please be careful whenever you're fixing anything to your roof. Make sure you're doing it properly, and if you're not confident, you can ask maybe a friend who knows what they're doing to give you a hand, or you can even ask for help at your local hardware store. Now we want to find the best sounding spot in our room, and to do that I like to set up my kick, my snare, and my hats, and I like to set up a kick microphone, a snare microphone, and one single mono overhead. The idea behind this setup isn't to make everything perfect, it's just to go for simplicity so that things are easy to move around the room. That's why I'm using a clip for my snare microphone, and I've only got a single mono overhead that looks down directly over the snare at the center. That's also why the stand for my kick drum microphone is butted up against the kick drum, because it's going to make it easy to find that same position if I move this setup around the room. I like to start off by setting my drums up in a corner, as corners are where low end builds up, and so you can kind of tune the low end of your drum set by moving it either closer into the corner or further out of the corner. Before we go moving the drum kit around the room, we want to make sure that our drums are generally in tune. Like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect, but if it's super wonky, it's going to make it harder to tell what's good and what's not because the drums are going to be kind of feeding us false information. And we also want to make sure that our microphones are more or less in phase. I'm going to jump over to my computer now and I'll show you the process I went through to make sure my microphones were in phase, and then I'll show you some different sound examples of my drums set up in different spots around the room. As you can see, I've got a couple of clips here of me playing drums, and this first one is basically everything I just described. So I'm backed up into the corner as far as I can get. My overhead is staring straight down at my snare drum. My snare mic and my kick mic have kind of just been set up randomly. So I've just clipped my snare mic on and thrown my kick mic inside the kick drum. And this first take is going to be a chance to see how everything's sounding and see what we get. Let's check it out and then we'll talk about what's going on. So there's some pretty funny stuff going on there. Let me explain what's going on with these tracks. I've got my kick, my snare, and my overhead, and all of those are coming down into this drum bus. The only thing that's on this drum bus is infinite EQ, and the only reason I have this here is because it's going to help us inspect the drums. That'll make more sense as I move on. So let's just get started. Generally, I like to start by soloing out my snare drum and my overhead microphone, and I'll flip the phase on my snare mic just to see how it's sounding. So I think I got kind of lucky with that one. Pretty easy decision right off the bat. We hit that phase button and it's like the whole snare comes back to life. That's a really good indicator that our snare and our overheads are in phase, and so I'm not going to move my snare or my overheads. I'm just going to leave this phase button flipped as we move forward. Now let's put in our kick mic and we'll flip the phase on our kick mic and see how that's sounding. That one might be a little bit harder to hear depending on what kind of system you're listening on, but I definitely think we're getting more low end without pressing our phase button. And so that's where this comes into play. What we can do is just add an unreasonable amount of low end to our sound. And it's going to make it easier to hear the relationship between our kick microphone and our overheads. Now, the reason I'm doing this on my drum bus and not on the individual tracks is because if we do it on the individual tracks without a linear phase EQ, we're going to change the phase relationship between those two tracks. And so doing it on the drum bus allows us to hear that bass boost without altering the phase relationship between our kick and our overheads. Let's try that again. I'll close this. And I'll flip the phase of my kick drum one more time while we listen. think that makes it a bit more obvious that there's more low end when the phase button isn't pushed in. But when the phase button is pushed in, the kick maybe sounds a little punchier. And so I wanted to try moving the microphone because it didn't feel as though I was getting as drastic a change as, say, when we pushed the phase button for our snare drum microphone. And like I said, that kind of a change is a good indicator that we're in a pretty good place phase-wise. So for this next take that I'm about to play, all I did was move the microphone in probably about an inch, maybe a little bit more. Because we're mostly trying to listen to our kick drum, I'm actually going to leave this bass boost on while we listen to this next take, and like last time, I'll flip the phase of my kick drum halfway through. So the results there are more or less the same as before. Not pushing our phase button is still giving us more low end, and part of the reason for that is going to be because the fundamental frequency of our kick drum is going to be much longer than the inch or so that I moved my kick drum. And so the difference that I'm going to get out of that inch is probably going to be heard less in the low end of the kick drum than it is going to be heard in the rest of the drum kit. So what I want you to actually listen to in these two takes is what happens to the snare drum. Listen to this. So when I flipped my phase then, the snare also went out of phase. We definitely got a lot less low end in the snare. What if I come back to this first take though? So what I'm hearing here is that flipping the phase in my kick drum microphone sounds about the same for my kick drum in both of these scenarios. I'm losing about the same amount of low end when I press my phase button. But my snare drum is getting cancelled more in this first take. And that makes sense as well, because our snare drum is at a higher fundamental frequency. When we move that microphone about an inch, we're going to hear a bigger change in the relationship between the snare in our kick microphone and the snare in everything else. So having done all of that, I actually decided that I was pretty happy with where my kick mic was positioned initially in this first take, and so I just moved it back and then did another take just to make sure that everything was sounding good. And so this take here in the red and this first take here are actually going to sound pretty similar. And I could have just started at this red take, given that the idea of this portion of the video is to talk about where we're going to put our drums. But I think the whole process is important, where we make sure that our phase is in check and that we're not getting any crazy problems from our drum kit before we get to this section here where we start moving the drum kit around the room. Now, with all of our phase and everything sorted, I've got these three takes here, this red one, this blue one, and this green one. So this red one here is me pushed right up in the corner, and I'm still going to leave this big bass boost on just because it's going to make it easier to hear the low end and the changes in there. All right, so here's our kind of baseline take of our drums way in the corner. Not bad, it's pretty good. Sitting in a corner is generally a pretty good spot for drums, and so that's something to keep in mind. I'm not really hearing too many problems there. The low end could be a little bit loose, but that's kind of hard to hear given that the microphone I'm using doesn't have a huge low end. And so nonetheless, we just want to keep that in mind as we move forward. For this next take in the blue, the drums are set up right in the middle of the room, and actually I was sitting probably about where I am now, maybe a little further that way, just facing the other way. Let's have a listen to that. Let's compare it to the one in the corner. So in the corner, middle of the room. So now you can kind of see what I'm talking about with that low end. In this blue take where the drums are in the middle of the room, we actually lost a lot of low end compared to this red take where the drums are in the corner. The other thing I want to point out about this blue take is that there's something funny going on in the high mids as well. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to pull this EQ back up. I'm just going to turn this guy off, and we'll pull up another band. about there at 2.38 kilohertz, there's kind of a nasty character to the drums. Let me play it in this red one back over here. And now back to the middle of the room. Back to the corner. Middle of the room. It's a subtle difference, but for that one, there's something really annoying in that kind of like upper mid range. And I can honestly say from experience, having recorded drums out in the middle of my room, as you start to boost top end, that gets really hard to deal with. And so this process of finding the best spot in your room is really important. And it's definitely one of those things that, like I said, is going to set you up for success in the long run. Moving on, let me turn this off. I'll turn this back on, given that it's how we've been listening to everything. And let's come over here. This is kind of, if this porridge is too warm and this porridge is too cold, this porridge is, in my opinion, just right. And I mean, I'm saying that because I already know how it sounds, and also because I've already done this a few times in this room. And so I generally know what sounds good in this room. And that's one of the other benefits of doing this, is you actually learn a lot about the space that you're recording in. Nonetheless, let's have a listen to this last one. And I'll point out, it's about halfway between where these two are set up. Out in the middle of the room. And in the corner. So I think I could pretty happily go with either the green or the red take here, but there are some considerations to point out, such as I think that the green take has a better balanced snare. The snare maybe sounds a little bit too woolly in the red take, but I think the kick drum does sound better in the red take. The other thing to consider is it's going to be a lot harder to set up if we're right in the corner like this red take. And so this green take here, where we're a little bit further out in the room, is probably logistically going to be a little bit better. And it's also going to keep some of the stuff like our snare drum balanced. The other thing about that low end is that it's pretty easy to add low end in. And so really we want to listen to the character of the low end of the kit as opposed to how much there is. Let me show you this. If I pull up R bass, and again, go pretty crazy with it. Now let's listen to the difference between in the corner and a little further out into the room. Let me play those two without pausing in between, starting with in the corner and then going to further out in the room. So you can hear that in this green take, the kick drum's actually a little bit shorter and punchier when we add that low end in, and that in this red take, it's actually a little bit flubbier and looser. Depending on the style, this might actually be really cool, but I'm not against having a slightly shorter low end with some punch to it. All right, I can pretty confidently say that I'm happy with this green take here, which is where the drums are set up at the moment. So now it's time to get the rest of our drums and microphones set up. Now, different people have different processes. I've seen people set up the shells before, then set up microphones for all the shells, and then set up cymbals to make sure that they're staying out of the way of the microphones. I don't really like to do that. I prefer to make sure my drums feel comfortable because I really want to make sure that I'm giving the best performance possible. I think the best quote I've ever heard in relation to that is that ears will forgive a good performance with bad sound, but they won't forgive a bad performance with good sound. Now you're on the home stretch. It's time to set up the rest of your drums and your microphones, and this is where all the hard work that we've put in up to this point starts to pay off. The process for setting everything up is the same as before when I got my phase right, And so in keeping with the spirit of the video, I've gone as simple as I can on this setup. I've got a spaced pair of stereo overheads, and I have a close mic on each of my drum shells. We'll have a listen to this setup where I don't have fresh heads, I don't have expensive microphones, I'm using 6 microphones on my drum kit all up, and by following all of the steps that I've outlined in this video, I was able to achieve this. Alright everybody, that's all for this video. Now I know the format was a little bit different, so let me know, did you like it? If you did, make sure you hit the like button as it does help the video a lot, and make sure you subscribe, and we'll do more videos like this in the future. Thanks for watching the video, stay safe, and you know what we say here at Weiss Advice, we are musicians, sound is our instrument. I'll catch you next time.